Would the story of Galvarino make a good video game? Welcome. Today's subject comes via a suggestion from Animalector5788, and I have a few ways I think a video game adaptation could work. Before we imagine games, we need to explore some context and the man behind the myth. Galvarino lived during the early decades of the Arauco War, a long and bitter conflict between Mapuche communities and Spanish colonizers in what's now south-central Chile. In late 1557, at the Battle of Lagunitas, Galvarino and many other Mapuche warriors were captured by Spanish forces led by Governor Mendoza. As punishment, several prisoners were mutilated, some lost a hand and their nose, but leaders like Galvarino had both their hands cut off. According to Spanish chronicles written around the same time and the epic poem La Araucana, Galvarino was sent back to his people mutilated, as a warning. But instead of submitting, Galvarino presented himself before his leaders and pressed for a renewed uprising. The story goes that he strapped knives to his forearms and returned to battle beside the Mapuche leader Caupolicán, fighting in the campaign that followed. Historical accounts disagree on Galvarino's end. Some Spanish sources claim he was captured again and executed. Sources vary on the method, switching between hanging or being thrown to dogs. But by the late 16th century, his death was officially recorded, and his legend had already taken hold in both Mapuche memory and Spanish literature. What makes Galvarino interesting as an historical figure, aside from his use of blades as prosthetics, is the combination of historical record and the myth that grew from it. A mutilated warrior who refused to bend, that tension, the fact feeding into the legend, is fire for muses, and that's a fire we'll use today to imagine 3 different ways his story could be told as a video game. I'll sketch out 3 game concepts, one that tells his story directly, one that lets his death spark another evolution, and one that leans into myth and spectacle. I'll also explain why I'll be arguing most strongly for the second option, and why the third is a line I, if I were a game developer, wouldn't cross. Game option 1, an historical, grounded narrative where you play as Galvarino himself. A game that follows his life, his capture at Lagunitas, the mutilation, and his return to the battlefield. Think Assassin's Creed or Red Dead style, a big budget cinematic open world that mixes action with historical inspired missions and well researched cultural immersion. This version's main design challenge is tone, I think. You're telling the story of someone who suffered a brutal mutilation. That violence can't be trivialised. A faithful approach would place enormous emphasis on cultural consultation, Mapuche voices in the writing, the accurate representation of ceremony and language use, with respectful representation of Mapuche tactics and spiritual beliefs. Mechanically, you could centre on resourceful combat and leadership rather than a focus on flashy combat. After his mutilation, Galvarino adapted. The knives on his wrists in Legend symbolised improvised tool-making and resilience, not a superpower. You could design mechanics around improvisation, crafting makeshift weapons, rallying fighters, using ambush tactics, and making hard strategic choices about whether to trade lives for greater objectives. Narrative beats could make the player weigh collective resistance versus individual revenge. The aesthetics then would be raw and grounded, mud and blood, arrow-scarred banners and tight close-ups in cutscenes that convey exhausted determination rather than sort of stylised brutality. This is the respectful option, the one that costs more but can tell a more powerful and authentic story. Game option 2. In the second option, Galvarino is not the protagonist. Instead, the game begins with the news of his capture and execution, and that single event becomes the ember that ignites a larger war of insurgency. You play as a younger Mapuche protagonist, perhaps a novice warrior or a messenger, maybe the child of a fallen leader, and Galvarino's death becomes both the legend and the driving force that shapes the entire campaign. This is the option I lean towards, and here's why. It works dramatically and ethically. First, the distance of a blank slate in main character terms allows the game to explore Galvarino's legacy. The protagonist carries Galvarino's memory, arguing about what he stood for and how to continue the resistance, and a moral complexity of if cycles of vengeance can ever really end. That internal debate produces a far richer narrative playground than replaying the story of a single man, even if the man in question is, without a doubt, incredible. I think of games like Ghost of Tsushima for parallels. There, a cultural invasion and a rigid code of honour produces a protagonist forced to choose how to fight. In this Mapuche story, players would make hard decisions about strategy, maybe diplomacy with neighbouring communities, and whether to follow the path of open battle or sabotage. Gameplay could alternate between guerrilla raids with stealth infiltrations and a more political moment where you rally different factions, highlighting that resistance is not only fought with weapons but with alliances and just sheer force of will. Crucially, this approach honours Galvarino by making him a driving force. The game can explore how his myth is made, how one people's suffering became a symbol to rally behind, and how songs and speeches reshape events. It could even explore how future generations interpret his sacrifice. You could include things like a legacy meter, not as a combat buff, but as a socio-political modifier that changes how villagers react and how new recruits join the resistance. It could also change how enemies respond, especially if you introduce a morality system that punishes gratuitous violence, but rewards strategic sacrifice. That would align with the theme that resistance can be a complicated and costly strategy, but still worth the price for freedom. Game option 3. This is a more mythic, heavy action route. Here, Galvarino's legend goes full supernatural. Knives for hands, a vengeance-fueled afterlife with stylish hack-and-slash combat in a world of shifting spirits. Imagine Devil May Cry, that fast-paced combat and surreal levels representing Mapuche spirituality. This option doesn't really sit right with me. I mean, it's compelling on a pure entertainment level, but I think it throws up some serious ethical problems. Turning a real person's torture into flashy, marketable action risks trivializing suffering and appropriating Mapuche spiritual beliefs. I think without deep, community-led involvement and a framing that prevents the historical figure from becoming a sort of fan service, this approach can cross a line from homage to exploitation. If a studio decided on supernatural elements, the better route would be to invent a clearly fictional protagonist inspired by Mapuche motifs rather than use Galvarino, or anchor the supernatural in allegory and avoid using real historical suffering as a primary hook. So which of the three is best? I suppose it depends on your goals as a storyteller and who you're telling that story for. Option 1 gives the direct historical biography, a potentially powerful AAA game that tries to get every cultural detail right. Option 2 gives more narrative flexibility and moral complexity, letting Galvarino's story amplify new voices in the same struggle. Option 3 sells flashy combat and art direction, but risks harm unless it's handled with the weight that it deserves. Personally, I prefer option 2 for the medium of video games. It respects the past while inviting players to think about how history makes heroes. It lets us ask questions about agency, memory, and representation, while delivering a dramatic game that can honestly explore violence and resistance in the colonial era. I'd be interested to know what you think though, let me know in the comments. Finally, if I were a developer or a creative director at a studio, here are a few concrete design suggestions for option 2. With the narrative framing, I'd perhaps start with the Galvarino's capture and execution in either a short cinematic or an interactive prologue, and then jump forward 5 or 10 years later, where the protagonist, shaped by Galvarino's legend, must gather allies and choose how to fight. In terms of gameplay, blending guerrilla action, sort of hit and run skirmishes and the destruction of enemy supplies and the like, with a base building element, protecting and expanding communities, along with heavy narrative beats where decisions change allies' morale, would make for a pretty interesting gameplay loop. Above all, it needs cultural authenticity. Hire Mapuche writers, voice actors, and historical consultants. Use the native tongue if possible, and provide translations in the form of subtitles, and depict ceremonies and daily life with respect for the culture that birthed them. It makes me wonder, how do you adapt real history into a game without it turning into more of a documentary-style point-and-click experience? The closest comparisons I can think of are Assassin's Creed, maybe Paradox's Expedition series, though Kingdom Come Deliverance probably hits closer to the mark. Still, the tone and focus and the why behind it would need to be approached very differently. Let me know what you think. And that's the finished painting. Galvarino lies at an interesting crossroads between myth and history, and as a final thought, I think Galvarino's story deserves respect, and if told well, I think a video game based around his life would make for a compelling story indeed. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see something covered in a future Painting the Lore, let me know by sharing it down below. Or if you'd like to see more, hit like and subscribe, your support is always greatly appreciated. Until next time, farewell.